Okay, let's talk about peers. In this set of slides, we're going to talk about adolescent peer relationships. We're also going to talk a little bit about substance use and abuse, and we're going to talk about depression and suicide. So let's just think for a minute about what a big deal peers are in adolescent life. There is a compulsive need to communicate with friends. Get off your phone, right? um you just need to know, be in touch with them, to know what's going on with them, to tell them what you think, to hear from them what they think. There's just this compulsive need, and one of the reasons why there is such a need is that peers are a reference group for this important identity formation that we just talked about as being a key aspect of adolescence. So your identity is forming, and the way that that forms is you compare who you are and how you're doing to what they're doing, and also how they see you. So you're referencing yourself in relationship to other people. And what often happens is that you're referencing yourself in relationship to a crowd of people that may be formed based on certain characteristics. In high school, in like the 1980s John Hughes movies like Pretty in Pink and 16 Candles and Breakfast Club, there's this idea that there are these crowds of, say, jocks who do the sports, and nerds who get good grades, and potheads who smoke marijuana, and others. Emo, like, we didn't have that when I was a kid, but you know that's a thing I see. And so they form around basically interests and such. And so these crowds then become sort of a key reference point for who you are as you're developing. Another aspect of how peers relate during this time is there's this thing known as sex cleavage, which is boys tend to stick with boys and girls tend to stick with girls. And sometimes they form romantic attachments and such and date. But in terms of like who you hang out with, it still tends to be um, uh, gendered. We we read already a little bit about this way of categorizing popularity and just sort of thinking about, well, what does that mean? So popular is often thought of as mostly liked. Controversial is thought of as liked by some and disliked by others. Rejected is those who are uniformly disliked by most people, and neglected is neither liked nor disliked. And these top two tend toward being of higher status, and these bottom two tend toward being lower status. And there is less loneliness in this higher status group and more loneliness in the lower status group. So, in some ways, I'll just go back here. You're going to latch on to a crowd, such as it is, whatever matches sort of what you're interested in, what you're good at. Um, and just in many ways so that you don't become one of these rejected or neglected. Um, and when I say you, I mean a typical teenager. But what's happening during this time is there's a lot of peer pressure to conform. And sometimes it's not like other peers are even intentionally putting pressure on adolescents. It's just that adolescents want to conform. They want to wear the right clothes. Like brand names become a proxy for self-worth. Like wouldn't be caught dead wearing those tennis shoes, those sneakers, or whatever you call it. Um, or the substances that you use are something that your crowd might use. Like jocks might get drunk but not smoke pot, or maybe everybody smokes pot nowadays. I don't know. Nobody calls it pot. I know that that's what my son says. But anyway, so these types of behaviors, you're conforming to what your group is doing. You also use language that your group is using. For example, slang shuts out people who don't know the meaning of the word. So my son is constant, I say, "What do you mean?" When, like, they didn't used to say sick. "Oh, that's sick." I don't. Now they say that and it means good, apparently. But, and did we sort of had our own slang, but I'm not even going to talk about the slang that we used when I was young because it's so embarrassing. There's also pop culture conformity. Like you conform to, you like what the same kind of music that your crowd likes, or you like songs that other people like, and you talk about the same shows, etc. And the irony here is that, as we've already talked about, there's such a desire for teens and adolescents to want to be autonomous and separate and unique and individual and respected for their decisions by their parents. So autonomy is desired of parents, but conformity is what they seek in terms of their relationship with friends. So autonomy and conformity in the same people. Very interesting. And this is sort of where you get this idea of generation gaps and generational differences. And in some ways, like, we could stop for a minute and think about the way that this is adaptive, the way that the new generation is actually wanting to do new things in new ways could be considered one of the way the species uses culture to advance the species, and that teens are advancing the culture in terms of hopefully improving it. Now, speaking of substance use, I wanted to take a moment and think about some of the reasons that adolescents use drugs. Because using drugs is something that we adults tend to not want adolescents to do. And yet it's something that they do. And I think it's silly just to tell somebody that they shouldn't do something. Just don't do it. Just say no. Okay, you can say that and maybe it'll help, but it's really important to understand why they would want to do it in the first place. So I found this really interesting list from this government website about what research has shown um, as to why adolescents do drugs. And on one level, they do it to fit in because others are doing it. They want to be like a part of the party or a part of a scene. They also do it just to feel good because it can feel good to be a little bit tipsy and drunk and not so worried and anxious and afraid and let things come out of your mouth in a blurting way. Or it can feel good, to alter your mind with so that your sensations are heightened and everything is beautiful. Like, those are good feelings. But also, adolescents use drugs to relieve distress. That's what this third point is about. It's to relieve uh, depression, anxiety, stress, pain. It can lessen these feelings. Now, I want to say here to stop and think about this third reason. Using drugs to reduce negative feelings is associated with higher risks of addiction. Using drugs just to feel good is something you can take or leave, right? But if what you're using to manage your negative feelings is a substance, every time that you feel bad, you're going to turn to the substance. And then when you don't have the substance, you're going to feel bad and you're going to turn to the substance. It's that cycle of addiction. So if you or someone in your life is sort of experimenting with drugs and they turn to drugs to make them feel better, to avoid their distress, that's something to stop and pay attention to because that's a red flag for developing an addiction. If you're experimenting with drugs and it's just kind of like a lark and fun, it's less uh, uh, it's it's less fearsome, it's less scary because there's just as good a chance that there are other ways to feel good other than just using drugs. But if this using drugs to manage negative emotions becomes a habit, that could become a problem. One thing I like about you guys is you've done a lot of reflecting in your discussion threads about how you work with children in your lives to help them manage their negative emotions, because that could possibly be one of the best things that you can do to prevent them from becoming addicted to drugs. If they have a way to manage their emotions that isn't drugs, um, that could be a really great thing. Another reason that adolescents use drugs is to do better in school. Like maybe if they just take this, they'll relax and perform better on the test, right? Or maybe it'll spike them up, in the realm of abusing ADHD medication. And then there's just the spirit of experimentation. They're motivated to try something new. And why I like this list is because if you discover that the adolescent in your life is using drugs, it may be important for you to understand why, and maybe to start to educate yourself on the risks of each of these reasons. Okay, here's just a chart about um, substance use that is increasing and decreasing. Vaping nicotine and marijuana is increasing, but vaping flavoring is decreasing. Using cigarettes tends to be decreasing, as with a hookah, although I didn't know that was a big deal. But marijuana use amongst 8th and 10th graders is on the rise, as is daily alcohol use in 12th grade. That's figures from 2019. And there's some things that we don't know about vaping. On one hand, it's maybe better for you than smoking. That's one of the things it's billed as. But we don't know about the effects of these flavorings or volatile compounds or heavy metals or ultrafine particles that go into your lungs. We don't know about the effect of vaping on long-term health. So I just wanted to point that out. Now, sometimes adolescents smoke marijuana to sort of make them feel grown up, adult, rebellious. And I kind of want to make this point of nicotine being a form of depression. Oh, I said it wrong. A nicotine being a form of oppression. And by oppression, I mean the powers that be selling cigarettes to people who can hardly afford them and um, profiting, essentially, right? So, one of the things we know about using nicotine is that the lower the education, the lower the income, the higher the likelihood to use these nicotine. Now, what do we know about lower education and lower income? More life stressors. So now you have nicotine as a way of relieving life stress. And that leads to a lifelong dependency, which means big profits for someone and early death for those, right? So, like, this just stinks. It stinks. And I want people to think about the choice to smoke nicotine or vape or whatever as willingly giving your money and your health to somebody who wants to profit from you. Such a bad idea. Let's talk about delinquency. There's a bit in the textbook about delinquency, and it seems like they spend an awful lot of time talking about minority and ethnicity in terms of delinquency. And so, I'm not even going to, there are different forms of delinquency. Here we see some are under socialized, meaning they're delinquent because they were raised with little discipline or little parental supervision. And that's different than a socialized delinquent who knows all of this norms and behaviors that society condones. And they're fairly normal psychologically, but they still engage in delinquent behavior. But I wanted to take a minute and think about racial discrimination. I don't want to just see that certain minorities have higher levels of delinquency than other minorities without talking about racial discrimination. And so I went and I found some studies that really make some important points. So, racial discrimination itself is associated with many negative outcomes. So, somebody who experiences racial discrimination, they're going to have more depression and other symptoms of turning against yourself, like anxiety and such. They're going to have greater psychological distress, less self esteem, lower academic achievement and engagement, less academic motivation, greater engagement in externalizing behaviors, that would be like aggression, risky sexual behaviors, substance abuse, and more association with deviant peers. This research was not research on minorities. This was research that showed, regardless of whether someone was a minority or not, if they experienced racial discrimination, these were the negative outcomes. So, this is evidence that suggests when we say certain minority may have higher levels of crime, we should also be considering minorities that experience more racial discrimination would then reasonably have higher levels of these negative outcomes. Now, here's another thing that and what I'm trying to say is like, it's not the minority status itself that is likely to be the relationship, but the degree of discrimination against that minority status that may predict these negative outcomes. All right. Discrimination from different sources affects different outcomes. And this is interesting. I thought this was really interesting because this particular study broke it down in terms of depending on where the discrimination was coming from, it had an impact, a different impact on the outcome. So let me just see if I can make sense of it here. So when schools were had more racial discrimination, it was associated with poorer academic performance. But when peers were the perpetrators of discrimination, there was more psychological maladjustment. It may not have been related to academic performance. And when there was greater societal discrimination in general, that was associated with heightened racial awareness, which isn't necessarily at all a bad thing, because we saw in our other research that certain types of racial awareness can be a protective factor. And now I also in terms of delinquency, I'm not done with this just racial discrimination thing, because there's a bias in arrests. So this particular research is fascinating because it looked at only those who were arrested. It didn't look at, who's more likely to be convicted of a crime proportionately to their race. It looked at who's more likely, um, oh, I should have practiced this better, forgive me. But amongst those who are arrested, here's what was found. Whites who are arrested get cited and released more often than minorities who get booked and jailed more often. And that those minorities in this study include American Indians, Latino, and Black persons. So even among people who are just arrested, Black people, Latinos, and Indians are more likely to be booked and jailed. So whites get off easier. And here, when minorities are arrested, they are more likely to be convicted and serve time than whites who are arrested. So when we look at these figures and we think about, like, there's a myth out there that blacks commit more crime. And I've heard that, and I'm just like, well, I don't buy it. I don't buy it, because look at what happens when you're arrested for the same crime. You're just punished differently in the justice system. And that's why we need to work on social justice in our country, because this stuff goes on. Moving right along, now we're going to talk about a little bit about depression. And this is sort of the intersection of how peers relate to depression. And this particular research was interesting because it was found that peer attachment may have a somewhat bigger influence on adolescent depression than parental attachment. because we've spent an awful lot of time talking about how parents impact the outcome of children. And now here we are in adolescence, and we're actually starting to see that peers are having, in some cases, a bigger impact than parents even have. And so that's part of the letting go that parents need to have, but also not letting go with hands off, because one thing we do know is that parental monitoring is a protective factor for adolescents at this age. But when adolescents had low levels of attachment with peers, they were let me just read this last bit. Those high on peer but low on parent attachment were better adjusted than those high on parent but low on peer attachment. So that's something to think about. Now, as we talk about depression, we want to know, like, how prevalent is it? And roughly this is from 2020, 8.4%. No, I'm sorry, 2019, 8.4% of children between 6 and 17 have been diagnosed with depression. That's almost 1 in 10. That means that in our class of 30 people, there are 3 people that have been diagnosed with depression. I mean, obviously, that I don't know that for a fact, but it's quite likely that the odds would have it that, a number of us have been diagnosed with depression. So it's really not that uncommon for people to experience depression, even at these young ages. But even more disturbing is this data point that suicide is the second leading cause of death for this age group. So the largest by far is unintentional injuries. But the second leading cause of death is suicide for 10 to 14 and 15 to 24. Now, what we're going to see when we look at early adulthood is that suicides are more common in early adulthood and emerging adulthood than they are in adolescence, but it's still a very important concern. And I'm jumping around a little bit, but what I wanted to talk about here was this idea of need satisfaction and its relationship to depressive symptoms. So, like, what really predicts whether somebody's going to be depressed or not? And what is fascinating from this study is that children get depressed for different reasons than adolescents, and it maps to the basic phases that we've been talking about, the sort of developmental needs. So here, in this research, they found that amongst children, depressive symptoms were related to deficits in the need for competence. So when children felt that they weren't competent, they were more likely to have depressive symptoms. But these were not related in childhood to autonomy and relatedness needs. It was mostly competence needs. So remember, we talked about developing mastery as being that's what children really need to know, that they're good at something. But guess what? When you get to adolescence, competence is no longer significantly related to depressive symptoms, but autonomy and sociality or relatedness or belonging, those were the significant predictors of depression in adolescence. So you can see how children need to become good at something, and then adolescents need to understand how who they are, what they're good at, relates to other people and and can express itself in the world. Okay? And the last point here is the degree to which hopelessness predicts suicidality. So, we've talked a lot about parental warmth as being this protective factor, and it is a protective factor, even against suicide. So, and I also want to highlight the role of hopelessness in this whole thing. So, hopelessness is not the same as distress. Hopelessness is not the same as feeling bad. Hopelessness is not the same as feeling like a failure at a certain event. Hopelessness is the sense that what is bad now will continue on into the future, that there's no point in the future. So this is focusing on this idea that if an adolescent doesn't have a sense of a positive future to move toward, their vulnerability to suicide goes up. So, in this research, warmth predicted less hopelessness, and parental psychological control predicted more hopelessness in adolescents. So, when parents were controlling them psychologically, and hopelessness itself predicted higher levels of suicidality, like suicidal intentions in adolescents. So, as we think about adolescence, think about one of the core things that an adolescent needs is hope. And that's also why I wanted to put an emphasis on adolescents not just finding who they are, but also finding a purpose, finding something that draws them forth into the future. Because at no time is a human being more involved in answering questions about their future than adolescents are. You know, children aren't asked, who do you want to be when you're a teenager? They're asked, who do you want to be when you grow up, right? And adolescents are right on the verge of being grown up. They're right on the verge of having to answer this question of who do you want to be? So they're not just answering who are they, they're also answering who are they going to be. And that answer has to be compelling enough to draw them into the future. So when you're raising a teen or working with teenagers, remember how important hope is. And that's all for today.